Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well, Rory. I really am, and I'm very grateful that you have joined us as a listener for episode 243 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. You're in good hands with Rory and myself, and we warmly welcome you. 3 topics we're going to be covering today, starting off with that theory in practice, where we look a little bit of theory that we might learn during our training, and then we see how does that really apply itself into practice. And today we're looking at contracting. That's a massive, massive topic. There's a massive theory side to that, but also how does it show up in our practice? We then go on to Practice Partner, where we speak about setting up, running a private practice. Maybe part-time, maybe full-time. And today we're going to be speaking about the portfolio practice, where we incorporate other elements to balance off our practice as a counsellor or a psychotherapist. And then we end today with Practice Matters, where we look at an element of practice that may come up. We may see it in our day-to-day practice. And we have an expert that you reached out to, that you interviewed, Rory, that also built a really good lecture for the Counsellor CPD Library. And it is Dr. John Wilson, who is an expert on grief. And today we're digging deep into grief and looking at how adverse circumstances can complicate grief. A really worthwhile chat there, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. By a real expert, someone who's the top of the tree when it comes to researching grief and how grief presents.
A word comes to my mind, luminary. I love the sound of that.
Yes, it kind of lights up everything, doesn't it?
Does,
it's very
doesn't it?
illuminates.
So let's illuminate our first topic today, which is theory in practice, where we take some theory, look at how it applies in practice. Contracting. Let's just start off with the theory of contracting before we look at how it appears in our practice, Rory.
Yes. Well, first of all, I can remember when I started my counselling studies many, many years ago, I was quite surprised in contracting because I came from a commercial background, and contracting was about business. It was about, buying something, buying a house, you exchange your contracts. You buy a car, you contract. So I was kind of taken aback to find out that contracting was something in counselling, but it is actually one of the cornerstones of ethical practice. And contracting does have some kind of businessy elements in it. I guess if you're a private practitioner, that might be, fees and when they're paid. But generally speaking, in counselling, contracting is about transparency. It's about accountability. And it's also about diffusing power. Because when somebody comes to you as a client, be that in a simulated skills session in college, or be that as a qualified practitioner or a student practitioner working with clients, the contract gives a clear outline of things like confidentiality. So important. So clients can make an informed choice. And I think it's really interesting that as people go through their training, they may start off with a bit of a verbal contract, at kind of level 2, or the early stages, but it becomes an integral part of being a caring and competent therapist, allowing the client to know exactly what's on offer, exactly the time frame of what's on offer, and also the limits of confidentiality, so that clients can make an informed choice. And the ethical frameworks, every ethical framework talks about autonomy. It allows someone to look at that and say, I'm just clapping my hands here for those people who can't see, holding my hand up and holding an imaginary contract up and saying, this is what I'm being offered. Is it for me? And if it's not, then they can make an informed choice. It's such an important and integral part of our practices. And sometimes it's one that's sometimes maybe not given the focus it should do.
Yes. So from a theoretical point of view, we kind of get that. We're called upon by our ethical body to have a contract in place. It levels the playing field. As you said, Rory, it promotes autonomy from the client. Everybody understands what the rule of engagement are. You're going to have the time that you meet, when you meet, how long you're going to be meeting for, what medium you're going to be meeting over. So is that online? Boundaries around that, as in I can't be contacted outside of our regular sessions, or I can under these circumstances, and this how it works. So it's basically the rule book or the instructions that the client has access to, so that it is a shared understanding of what plays out in therapy. So there's your theory on it. Now, for me, in practice, the truth of this is when you are in that room and the door is closed. I'm taking an in-person, in-the-room scenario here, just using it as an example, but it's the same on the telephone or online, however you're working. But I'm going to use the room so that you've closed the door and you sit down in the chair, and opposite you is that client. You may look around and think that within that room is just yourself and that client, but the contract is there invisibly hanging between you and holding the boundaries and the rules of engagement of that relationship. So it's living within the interaction. So it's very much there within your practice when you are working. And for me, I think a contract is a living document. And what do I mean by a living document? Well, as legislation might change, or external factors might change, or ethical frameworks may change their ethical frameworks by ethical bodies might change, so we would go back to our contract and they would change. So I graduated many years ago, but if I was in practice right now, I would certainly not be using the same contract. Since then, legislation has changed, GDPR has come into effect, so much has happened. The larger of the ethical bodies in the United Kingdom have changed their rules around supervision and online working and their frameworks around that. So there's a lot of change, and it's a living document in that it changes. I think for me also, it is a living document in that it changes according to you and your practice. So if you are running your practice, you will consider beforehand what you will put in your contract. But you may find as you're going through the arc of therapy that something crops up in a session that you didn't expect, that you didn't account for, that you didn't plan for, and afterwards you're going to take that to supervision and say what happened. But there's always the question I always ask myself is, what can I do? Can I go back to my contract? Is there anything I can add or expand on in my contract that would cover this? And I'll give you a very basic example. You might in your contract say that we meet for 1 hour and we meet on a Thursday from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And that might be your time allocation for a client as an example. It may well be that the client arrives 20 minutes late for the session. And you might say to them, okay, well, we did say that it was from this time to this time, and that you can bring the contract back into the room. But afterwards, you might think about, okay, what can I put into my contract to cover if you're going to be late? So you may say, well, you're 20 minutes late, and the client may say, well, traffic was just at an absolute standstill. It's not their fault. They didn't do it purposely. And then in reconsidering your contract, you might put in a line that if you are going to be late and it is safe to do so, you might send me a text on the following number. And there's just an example of how something cropping up within practice might inform a change in your contract.
Yeah, I like the way you've alluded to contracts being changeable living documents. And I think certainly when I went into private practice, I took the contracts I had as a agency practitioner, and I had to have a good look at it, because there were certain things that the agency asked for that I didn't have to ask for as a private practitioner. One, if my memory serves me right, was doing reporting forms. So the agency had funders. Funders wanted to know certain things about how therapy was progressing, and that was done with a tick box form, a very simple tick box form. Well, I didn't need to do that. And also, of course, the law changed. We went from, certainly here in the UK, the Data Protection Act of 1998 to General Data Protection Regulations of 2018. So that had to be rewritten, and I'm conscious, Ken, that we have an international listener who listens in, and the laws in your country would go into your contracts. The laws in the UK may not be applicable to laws in your country. So have a look at laws in your country. And one of the other aspects of the contract, you've talked about boundaries and how you're saying that the therapy takes place at this time and this time only, which is fine. But if there was ever a complaint put against a therapist, one of the things that the ethical body would ask for would be, what is your contract?
Yeah.
What is your contract? And if you've not, there's the old saying in services, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist.
Yep.
And when I started, verbal contracting was really what everybody did. In fact, my tutor said, you don't really have to have a written contract. Nowadays, I think it's essential, from my point of view anyway, to have a written contract, and the client gets a copy, and you make sure the client can understand the contract. So it should be written in very easy to access language, and in the language that a client can understand. If you've got a client who's not an English speaker, then I think there's the principal position there of having your contract translated into language they can speak. And I'm sure a lot of people have done that. But they are so important. And I want to discuss something that is sometimes people struggle with as therapists, I think, and that's power. Because contracting gives you the opportunity to use power. We've talked about power many times in the contracts, and power's pretty benign. It's how it's used, it's how it's applied. And with a contract, you have a power to be able to take a decision in practice that may make a big difference to someone. So some people would have in their contract harm to self and harm to others. And if a client came in and said, I'm going to, do X, Y, and Z to A, B, and C, and they had a plan and they were going to do it, then as a therapist, you could break confidentiality. We both understood the limits of the contract. You may save someone's life. You may save the client's life, in terms of, a client may be talking about taking their own life. And, if you have that built into your contract, if I believe you're going to harm yourself or others, you can use that power that's within the contract, maybe to help and allow the client a little bit more time to consider their position. And I think that's something that really isn't talked a lot about in terms of contracts, and it gives you the ability to use power in a positive way.
It's interesting that you say that, Rory, because as you're saying that, it's a seesaw for me, because yes, we need to have that initial power used for the forces of good to create that protective bubble and that environment. And there are just legislation and things outside of our control that we don't choose, that we have to comply with, like legislation that we need to share with the client. And I guess there's a power imbalance in that, because we're saying this is how it's going to be. This is it. I've written it down here. But at the same time, it balances the power because it gives the client the full understanding of what is an offer. They have the right at any stage to go, you know what, no, I don't agree to this, and I'm not going to take part in therapy with you, which means that they have the choice of entering into this. And it depends on your modality, but you may be working with a modality like person-centered, where the client directs the way within therapy. Well, of course, within the contracting, that is not so. It can't be so because we have to put that over. We have to contract. But I guess at the same time, it is person-centered because we're saying, do you understand that? Is there any questions you may have about that? Are you okay to proceed within the parameters of this contract? So it is person-centered, I guess. And what you said, Rory, in terms of if there is a complaint laid, the first document you're going to be asked to produce is your contract. And I guess the second part of that is to evidence in some way that that contract was shared with the client and it was accepted by the client. You know, and that can be tricky. And I know we train counselors in online and phone counseling. We have for a number of years now. And contracting is very much a part of that training, because contracting when working online or via phone or via a digital technology will differ from a in-person, in the same room, face-to-face interaction. And in terms of the challenge that might come up there is, how do you evidence that you shared this? How do you evidence that the client agreed to it? So if you're in the room face to face, they can sign it. But if you're working online or via telephone, how is that done? And of course, there are digital technologies available now where you can send a digital copy of something. The client can read over that and they can digitally sign that and send it back. And it carries almost a watermark that evidences that they did see it and that they did sign that. And there are apps that you can go and look. If you look digital signature apps, you will find them available. One is called DocuSign. We don't endorse that. It's just a keyword that kind of to start your own research on that one. But it is, you would, if there is a complaint, you would be asked to produce your contract and evidence that you shared that with the client, that they saw that. And I think if there's a challenge that comes from this, it is, if it's been some time since you last took the contract out and had a look at it, get it out, take it into your next supervision session, take in your contract and say, I just want to relook at my contract, and get a peer and another set of eyes looking at your contract with you and be asking the question, is it fully compliant? Does it cover everything that it needs to cover? And does it reflect the modern times? I think that there's richness in revisiting one's contract from time to time.
Absolutely, Ken. And when we talk about revisiting, we can revisit the contract with our clients. So sometimes clients present and they're in quite deep distress.
Yeah.
And I've done sessions where I've had clients who've been distraught for virtually the entire session, and I've always tried to at least get the non-negotiables of contracts across. Things like, certainly for the UK, Prevention of Terrorism Act. And I think it's principle just to say, how I approach it, because I kind of have a light way, try to have a light way of doing it. I'll say, there are some things that we need to do. I can see that you're distressed, but one of them is confidentiality. And if you say anything that I believe may be an act of terrorism, not that I've had any clients who are terrorists, that type of approach, then I'd have to disclose it. And then you can come back on the next session and revisit it. And I always say I did it in my own practice. And when I taught, I said to my students, look, do the contract on the first session, but return to it in the second session and say, we did a contract last week. Have you got any questions, anything you want to ask? And, if something comes up, then just tell me, and we can speak about it. Make the contract something that can be discussed in therapy. It's not this is how it's going to be, this is what you have to do, and there's no more discussion about it. And the truth of the matter is, very few clients question the contract. They're more interested in trying to find, a solution for what's on their worried mind, which is why we have to, keep in our minds, is our contract ethical? Is it fair? Does it reflect the current legislation? Supervision, peer review, as Ken said, is essential to keep the contracts fresh and in service of the clients. Yeah,
very, very much so. It's an important topic, and I think we've covered some interesting aspects of that. And in face-to-face in the room, it may well be that when that client arrives that very first time, it's the first time you see them, as Rory has kind of alluded to there. Sometimes a client will come in and they want to share their material, and we need to kind of pause that slightly and introduce the contract. It's always good practice to allow the client to take the contract away, read through it in their own time, have a think about it. And of course, in today's age, with the technology we have, there is the opportunity to send the contract pre-session. Pre-session, if you can get a copy of the contract to a client before they even interact with you via email, and if you offer a free session, now if you go back to our last episode 242, in this very slot, in a practice partner, we spoke about the journey from an inquiry to somebody becoming a client, and part of that might be that you do a 20-minute session to kind of feel one another out, and it would be okay at that session to say, this is the contract that I work with. I wouldn't go into any great detail there. I would maybe glance over that, but give it to the client and say, take that away, have a good read of that. If you do choose to come back and engage with me, we'll look over it together and see if you have any questions. But it gives them that opportunity of not seeing it for the first time when they're in the room with you. It can take a client maybe by surprise that there is a contract. You started this topic, Rory, by saying how surprised you were as a student of counselling when you found out there were contracts in counselling. So how much more surprising, and why should a client know? We don't presume. We go, well, hello and welcome, and this is the counselling contract, because we're in our frame of reference, this is an everyday event. We're going to softly introduce that in a kind way. There it is. I think the challenge there is go and review your own contract. If you're training, think about contracting. There is, of course, a Rory super duper handout on contracting, and this is on the theory of contracting. It's going to cover what should be in a contract or some of the items, but I think it's really important to note that a contract is going to be as varied and different as your practice is. There are going to be similarities with other contracts, but you're going to be covering how you work and what your practice entails. And that's why when I see kind of messages on Facebook saying, can somebody share their contract with me? I need a contract. Just be wary of using somebody else's contract. You can pick out some of those elements that are going to be the same, but have a think about your practice, the uniqueness of that, and what do you bring to it? Even if you're a student, even if you're in placement, generally in placement, you might be working with an agency contract. Did you look through that beforehand? Do you agree with that? Are you fluent at explaining that and putting that over to the client in a kind way and in an understanding way to ensure they get it and that they know what they're entering into? Because it's your practice. Even if you're working in an agency and you're using their contract, is you and your practice within that agency. So you want to be comfortable with that. So where do we get the super duper handout? You go to counsellingtutor.com, and very top of the page, that's our mother website, you're going to find a tab that says podcasts. Click on the podcast tab, find your way to episode 243. Right there on that page, we have our show notes where we speak about this episode. We have external links to build out the topics that Rory and I discuss. And right there within that page, you can download super duper handout on contracting.
Contracting again.
Got there eventually, Rory.
Yeah.
Theory to Practice is proudly sponsored by CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. So there you have it. That is our theory and practice today on contracting. Moving on into practice partner. The portfolio practice rule. What is a portfolio practice?
Well, I think it's interesting, and it is a question that comes up quite a lot in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, knock on the door, and our friendly moderators will let you in, and you can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people, counsellors, students, tutors, supervisors, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And one of the big questions that always gets discussed is, when I qualify, what am I going to do? Where's the work? How am I going to develop my practice? And the portfolio practice effectively is doing different things themed to the what you're studying. So you've studied counselling and psychotherapy. You might have studied psychotherapy or counselling. What else can you do? And there is so many things that you can do apart from working with clients. Super important working with clients, and that's why most people decide to be counsellors. But there are other services. You could do CPD. You could do, think about doing coaching. And I think one of the really interesting things that I've noticed and I picked up in our Facebook group is we're seeing those who are qualifying having real specific interests in certain areas.
Yeah.
And there's no better way of developing that as something that you can, for want of a better word, sell. You can use that to gain an income. People have done a lot of research on something. That might be something that you can use as a consultant for an organization that's starting up. I know from my own practice, I started as a therapist, and then I went on to be a support worker and learned how the mental health services worked. Which was really interested. I worked in the criminal justice system, or an adjunct to the criminal justice system, so I understood, mental health and offenders and an idea of what was going on for them. And then eventually, I started teaching. So I've had quite a portfolio career and continue to do so. But I think it's making the most of opportunities. Ours is a rich profession with lots of voices. And I think, contributing to being those voices, if you've got an idea, if you've got a particular passion, then pursue it, and it can make you part of your career, Ken.
Yeah, definitely. So this slot, practice partner, is all about going into private practice, earning a living from counselling. And Rory, you put it beautifully in terms of you get to the end of your studies and it's like, now what? And we see it so often in the Facebook group. Is there any work in counselling? And it can be tricky when you first graduate, when you first go out. It can be tricky when you first start your private practice. For example, you may be working in an agency, have more than enough clients, and decide, I want to do this on my own. And you go into your own private practice, and we've discussed in previous episodes kind of what that might what the building blocks of that might look like. But one of the guarantees is that it takes time. It takes time to build a practice. It really does. It takes time to get the word out, to become established, to have the referral pathways coming into you. And how do we put beans in the cupboard? That's how I describe making a living. When I open my cupboard, I need a tin of beans that I can put on some toast. We need that. How do we put beans in the cupboard from working as a counsellor with the skills that we have learned? And the portfolio career suggests that we can look at alternate income streams while we build our practice, or even to complement our practice. And this is common not just in counselling, but in many other professions and areas. And Rory, you've already spoken about a couple of those. So some examples. Perhaps you have a special interest in a certain area within counselling or psychotherapy. Perhaps you've studied extensively in that area. Perhaps you wrote your master's in that area. Well, there's an opportunity to maybe share that information with other therapists that may benefit from that through presenting CPD lectures. And CPD lectures, you can promote them yourself. You can use the Facebook groups that are out there to say that you're doing a certain CPD. There are ticketing services online, like, and I'm just using this as an example, like Eventbrite, where you can list it and people can buy access to your CPD, and you can train others or guide others in your area of specialism. You can be known as an expert in that area. So delivering CPD is perhaps an area. If you're really passionate about a certain area and you're delivering CPD on that, maybe there's an opportunity to self-publish a book. You know, in this day and age that we live in now, on Amazon, you can actually publish a book where you submit the words and they do the rest of the work for you. They'll even find you a cover photo and lay it out for you and the whole tutti, and you put it up there and you can sell it on Amazon. And I have a book, Counselling Skills, a Student Guide. Rory, you have a book available on Amazon. We've co-written a book together on online and telephone counselling, a practitioner's guide, and they do pretty well. You know, we're sharing that knowledge with other counsellors, people buy them, and it is a supplement to income coming in. So we now have that you can do some CPD, you can write a book, and I just have to put out there, many of you will know, if you're a regular listener, you're going to know I'm dyslexic. Rory, you dyslexic?
I'm dyslexic,
yeah,
definitely.
Both of us dyslexic. You know, if someone has said one day you'll write a book, I would not have believed them, because I'm dyslexic and writing just brings up all kinds of stuff for me. But we used a service where we wrote it as best we could with all of our dyslexia and gave it to a professional who kind of went over that. So if you do have kind of barriers where you think, oh, I can't do that, because there are ways around it. And just as an example, if you go online, there's a website called Fiverr. It's Fiverr, Fiverr.com. And you can find services on there like copywriting or proofreading or something like that. So you can have assistance to bring something like a book to market. And then another area is, as you said, Rory, teaching. And it's certainly what I did. You know, when I graduated, I looked at going into my own private practice, realized that was going to take some time. I worked in a medical center for some time as I was starting to build the private practice. And I went and did a further education, a teaching qualification, and taught alongside Rory. And I supplemented my counselling income with teaching. I was still involved in counselling. It was still involved in making a difference, because the students would become passionate and they would go out and see their clients. So it was still aligned to the core values that brought me into wanting to be a counsellor at the first time. And you know, the thing is, there's a shortage of tutors. If you go and do that bit of extra training after you graduate, you certainly not struggle, I think, Rory, to find tutor jobs.
It's true, and I did my teacher training, and one thing I didn't realise was that once you qualify to be a teacher, you can teach what you know.
Yeah,
you can teach what you know. So that kind of opened the door. And as you were talking, Ken, I just went back to my student days, where, you know, this was brought up. I think it's probably in my certificate, which would be, I think, about 2000 maybe. And it would have been in 2000, I think. And somebody said, you know, well, how would you do that? And how would you know, if you had a skill, how would you do that? And the tutor said, what we'd do is you'd write a letter and you'd put a stamp on it and you'd send it to people who are interested. And gosh, haven't times changed?
Oh, yeah.
You know, with the advent of social media, especially YouTube, you've got literally your own TV channel. You know, you can apparently you can load videos up onto YouTube and become popular. That's what I've been told. And there's lots of opportunity. And one of the things that I would say is that those people who've got a real passion, who really want to change things and make things better, their voices tend nowadays to get heard. They may not get heard in the traditional sense, you know. Many years ago, you had to write to a publisher, and it took a long time for the publisher to respond. But nowadays, things are a lot faster. And if you've got an idea or a supplement to an idea, it's amazing. It's amazing what you can do, you know, just by what's on your computer. It's the opportunities, I think, are there. It's just a case of having a really good strategy to get known and to get your ideas across.
Yeah, I think it starts with thinking. Is a portfolio practice of interest to you, and moving in that direction? Do you have a book in you? Do you have a special interest in you? We've spoken about that CPD, and I guess the step up from CPD is building a little mini course where you teach something that you know. And the truth of the matter is, I think, Rory, you were speaking about your portfolio career, but I think your portfolio career is so much bigger than that, in that you now are owner director in Counselling Tutor.
Yeah.
And it really is an example of a portfolio career. It's so aligned to counselling, yet it's different. We do a podcast, and we're not experts. We say this all the time. We are not experts. We are two peers that get together and we talk about topics that are of interest that would come up in our Facebook group. And we're on episode 243 at the moment, and we're around about 2 million downloads. That means that people want to hear it. You're listening to this right now. People want to hear, and I'm nobody special. That I can promise you. I won't speak for Rory because I think you're rather special, Rory. But it's about self-defecation. Is that? Oh, that didn't sound right. That
deprecation.
Yeah. Okay. The letters are going to be streaming in now. Yeah. If you're watching me on the YouTube version, you'll see I'm going slightly red now. Is that a Freudian slip, Rory?
I think someone might be saying it's a Freudian slip, but
and the psychoanalysts have got the pens out.
Yeah.
But there you go. What have you got to say? What have you got? And in Counselling Tutor, we built a CPD library because we had so many professionals saying, that CPD, that I would get in a car, drive for 3 hours, stay at a hotel. So we built an online CPD library, and the content in that online CPD library is created by therapists. It's created by therapists who've got a special interest in a certain area and are able to do a lecture on what they know and share it with other therapists. So there are so many opportunities out if we consider the portfolio career. It's just looking, I guess, out of the box slightly and looking at what complements what we do. What can we grow, and how can we serve in other ways that will put tins of beans in the cupboard? And we come back to that, of course, because we're speaking about practice partner, and it's about going into private practice. There you have it, Rory.
There you have it, Ken. And I like that. I like what you say. Yes, we have to put tins of beans. Well, I tried to avoid tins of beans. I lived on enough beans when I was a student. I think we had beans on toast 3 times a week. I wanted maybe tomatoes or something a little nicer, and everything that you do in terms of wanting to kind of grow your practice and capitalize, if I can use that word, on your very, very hard work that you've done as a student and a student counsellor, should be about being in service. You're going to be on the right side of things if your first and foremost idea is, I can actually help people with this idea. Yeah. People need this, and you then develop it. That was the whole reason for the YouTube channel, for everything we've done in Counselling Tutor, to help other people. It was an extension of our teaching practices. And I would agree with you, Ken. I'm nothing special. I was someone who didn't have any qualifications until I walked into the college at 42 or 43. I'm dyslexic, and I just tried out different ideas. Just try this might be helpful for people, that might be helpful for people. Everybody's got some kind of gift, and if you can harness that, you are away. Finally, there is a principal position. I know that some colleagues just want to be counsellors. That's all they want to do. And if that is who you are, then more power to your elbow. A portfolio career might not suit everybody. And if you just want to be there, just to do the work, just to do the craft, then I take my hat off to you, to be honest, Ken.
Yeah, me too. And again, it comes back to Rory and I are by no means experts. We're just two peers having these discussions, and we just hope that they are useful for you. And I guess the motivation for bringing Portfolio Career today was to just spark that there are other alternatives. If we are blinkered in on, I am a counsellor, I need to find a counselling clients, or a counselling job, it can narrow what opportunities are out there. What is your special interest? We have many peers. We've got Tamara, who loves paperwork, so she started private practice paperwork and serves fellow counsellors via something that I don't like. I don't like doing paperwork. She does. Who'd have thought that you can start a business like that? And it's wonderful, and she's well supported through that. So what is your superpower? What would you consider a portfolio opportunity for you is the consideration. So there it is. That's Practice Partner. We're now moving on to Practice Matters, where we take an element that may well arrive in front of us in our practice. And I think grief, Rory, is something that comes in all the time in many, many different ways. And I know that you met up with one of the top researchers and lecturers into grief, and of course that is Dr. John Wilson, to delve deep into grief and look at how adverse circumstances can complicate grief.
Yes, and I think it's a great example of someone who specialises in one specific area. I know that Dr. John Wilson is a well qualified person in other areas, but he's well known for grief. And I spoke to Dr. John Wilson about how adverse circumstances can complicate grief, the world of complicated grief. He's done a fantastic lecture for us, and I caught up with him to ask, what is how do adverse circumstances impact on grief? And this is what he had to say.
Practice Matters.
The National Counselling Society is proud to sponsor Practice Matters. National Counselling Society are really excited to have launched their Children and Young People Therapist Register for counsellors working with the younger age group. To find out more, visit nationalcounselingsociety.org. nationalcounselingsociety.org.
And we welcome Dr. John Wilson, who's done a fantastic lecture for us on understanding how adverse circumstances can complicate grief for both the CSR and the CPD library. So, Dr. John Wilson, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Rory.
Now, the title of the lecture is Adverse Circumstances. What do you consider to be adverse circumstances? How would a practitioner know that grief is being complicated by adverse circumstances?
Well, there are some things that you could kind of recognise from common sense, I suppose. So, for example, if it was a sudden and unexpected death, if it was traumatic, you would expect there to be a chance of complications. But actually, that isn't always the case. Sometimes people can have quite traumatic situations, but because of their natural resilience, they're not. The grief isn't complicated as a result. But there's one or two other things that are perhaps less likely to be in our thoughts, really. So, for example, personality plays a big part. Attachment style. I mean, insecurely attached people are likely to not do as well. Where somebody loses a spouse, if there's been a real high emotional and even practical dependency on that person, that's going to make a huge difference as well. And then things like, for example, losing a partner is probably worse than losing an uncle or an auntie or a sibling or something like that. So those kind of things. And then another one that perhaps you wouldn't expect necessarily is the part played by loneliness and isolation. That can be a complicator as well. So they're the kind of main ones, really. That's things that would be obvious, but sometimes even what looks obvious doesn't turn out to be a complicator. And there's less likely things that might catch you out.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that I'm taking away from this is that we shouldn't let our own perception of what grief is colour our work with clients. We may have had our own experiences of grief, and those could be fairly deep, but we might meet someone whose presentation of grief isn't as deep as yours. So
that's right. And actually, Mick Cooper and John Norcross have done some research on that, and they call it false consensus effect. And it's where you make all sorts of assumptions that if, suppose you've lost somebody, that your client is going to have the same reaction and need the same things that you needed. And I mean, as somebody that's lost a child, I'm really careful that I don't make any assumptions if I meet another man that's lost a child. Absolutely,
and I think that's something that we need to think about as practitioners. That our objective or subjective experience, I guess it's subjective experience, may not match the client's. Every client is different. And you talked about complications, and you touched on the fact that someone may be dependent on the spouse. So the loss of the spouse and loss of other things can complicate grief.
Yes, we talk about things like, in the jargon, it's called assumptive grief, that assumptive world theory from Colin Murray Parks. And so many things go. So things that you did together, things that you watched together, places that you went together, all those things. Maybe your partner was somebody that always took you a cup of tea in the morning and suddenly that's gone. So there's all sorts of things like that, the assumptive world that you kind of lose in that process, things that you took for granted. And that can be a huge part of the grief. And a lot of focused grief work is sometimes about helping the person adapt to all those changes.
Yes. I think that is a really important part of working with grief, because as a result of grief, there is a change, and sometimes people find it very hard to adapt to and meet the change that has really been put upon them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It can be a huge part. And where a client is resilient, which I think probably resilience is in this context is best defined as somebody willing to embrace change. So if a resilient client manages that pretty well usually, even if there was potential for a complication in their grief. But some people are less resilient, so that some personality styles are much harder to work with, and their grief can be problematic for a very long time and actually become that the disorder that we call complicated grief.
So when you talk about some personality styles can have a bigger difficulty with grief, what type of personality styles would you be referring to?
Well, I think the research just refers to it as high neuroticism, which is a bit judgmental, but that's what the research says. That's the terminology they use. But I think also attachment style has got quite a lot to do with it. But when sometimes we meet a client and we just notice that they're a bit, that there's something about their body language that's quite clingy, that they hang on every word. They want to be quite close to us physically sometimes, and we can feel quite claustrophobic as practitioners. And those people are very often going to be very difficult to work with because they've got that kind of neediness that's going to complicate their grief.
Yes, and I guess as all therapists, whether we're working grief work or not, we're trying to help the client gain more autonomy in their lives and be self-directing. What would a therapist need to consider if they had a client who was very clingy, who was absolutely bereft? Is there any direction that a therapist can go that might negate or be able to work or contain that presentation or those presentations?
Yeah, well, I'm quite proactive in so much as I can sometimes be quite directive. I'll give you a really good example. I had a client a long time ago who was finding it really difficult to adapt to the loss of her husband, but that was all that was in her life. And so, we talked about, well, she needed other things to do, and she found groups that she could join. For a time, we even suspended the counselling while she did that, and I was able to facilitate a Macmillan group that I knew about that she could go to. and even had the facilitator look out the door for her because she was a bit nervous about going in the room on her own. And it was just huge. I mean, the change in her was enormous because she met other widows, she made friends, she went on cinema and theatre trips with them, and it did kind of change. So I think sometimes we do need to be quite proactive sometimes. The other thing that I do a lot of is just in working pluralistically, is that recognition that they're an expert in their own loss as well. And I think we have to sometimes, we often in Rogerian counselling talk about empowering the client, but actually they've already got power. Sometimes it's a matter of collaborating and tapping into their power and recognising there's two experts in the room. And I do find that's quite useful sometimes, and giving them choices about on which they work on first. I mean, it might be about developing a continuing bond. It might be about adapting to the loss. It might be about having times when they distract themselves from their grief with a hobby or an interest, or it's really just a matter of just tapping into what they need. But sometimes they need our expertise to present the choices in front of them.
I think that's the interesting one, because it's quite an existential perspective, isn't it? Working with choices, I think, and
yes.
What choices do you have? And it may be something that maybe people who are listening who are from a person-centred canon may find that difficult to use questioning. Do you think that you have to adapt your modality of therapy to work effectively with grief?
Well, I mean, I trained in person-centred stroke relational in 1995 to 97. And kind of started working in bereavement work and started to use kind of a pure Rogerian approach as much as I could. And I actually found that it lacked something, that sometimes clients didn't move. And there's something about that numbness and that rabbit in the headlights of a newly bereaved person that sometimes it's almost like cradling them and picking them up and saying, this is what you need, this is what I can offer, and being that little bit more proactive.
Yes, and you mentioned directionality, and I like the way you've alluded to maybe looking at outside support and expanding the options that a client may have when they don't know what the options are.
And I think sometimes, Rory, there's some evidence that although women will very often want to work with their kind of emotions and so on, men might be much more cognitive, much more practical. And there was some research done a few years ago with couples that had lost a child, and it was group work with kind of emotional support. The wives improved and the men didn't. And the researchers' explanation was that maybe men needed something much more practical and cognitive, and that sharing their feelings wasn't good for them, wasn't what they needed. Yeah. So I think it is that tapping into what's appropriate for the client.
Now, I know there's at least one theory that talks about oscillation, clients oscillating between the loss and being proactive and engaging the world as it is. Do you think that, and I'm sure you're going to share that theory with us, but do you think that the use of that theory is helpful when working with bereavement?
I do, all the time. And in fact, sometimes, because there's evidence that you shouldn't work with a bereaved person too soon, you should let them sort of settle into their grief naturally. There's quite a lot of evidence to say that. What we used to do when I worked in a service, in a bereavement service at the hospice, was that if somebody wanted to be seen early, a lot of it was about normalising, reassuring, but we always gave them a copy of the dual process model to take away and say, look, this has been shown to help. So don't dwell all the time on your grief. Spend some of your time getting on with other things and going out and deliberately distracting yourselves. And so, it's a psychoeducation with that one, really.
Yes, because it's kind of interesting when you're moving into the psychoeducation side of things. It almost sounds like how you'd work with trauma. I mean, I'm not saying for a second that the loss of a loved one isn't traumatic, but it is I'll ask the question, should therapists adopt a kind of trauma-informed approach when working with grief, or at least have it on the mind?
It's a really good question. The long-standing experts like Colin Murray Parks always maintain that if you're identifying trauma, then you work with the trauma before the grief. Now, I think it depends on the severity of the trauma personally. So I think sometimes simply talking through, making sense, the very act of talking through the events and the traumatic events can itself bring about change as the client begins to find meaning and understand exactly what happened and understand their own reactions to it. I think there are times when the situation has been so traumatic, then you need something much more specialised. And this is, again, where it comes into working pluralistically. I mean, I've just completed some EMDR training. I've not used it with a client yet, but it's something that previously, if I believed that a client was traumatised severely, then sometimes I would refer them on. They do the trauma work and then they come back for the grief work.
Yes, I mean, it's very, just to talk and hear you speaking about trauma and the wide panoply of presentation that clients can have, and what effectively what kind of toolbox you might need as a therapist. You talk about EMDR, you talk about referrals. I mean, all these things, at least referrals, in my view, should be something that should be in the toolbox. And if you're working pluralistically, like you say, you're co-creating a relationship where both of you are seeking the answers.
Yeah.
Anybody watching this lecture, what do you hope that they'll take away from it?
I hope they'll take away confidence to work. I hope they'll take away that recognition that everybody's grief is unique. I very often get asked if I will do some training on a specific kind of loss. And I never do, because I always say that it's the uniqueness. You might need to know about the kind of things you will meet in that loss, but I can't tell you exactly how to do it. And I'm a great valuer of the individual skills and creativity. I was once managing 36 volunteers, and I was absolutely in awe of how they all did things in their own different creative way, and that celebrating that and valuing that rather than saying, no, we have a way of doing it here. I think it's really important to recognise that. So I'm hoping people will take away the confidence to develop their own style, and in recognition that everybody's grief is so different, so unique.
Well, I think on those wise words and those very accurate observations, Dr. John Wilson, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you to Dr. Wilson. Big thank you to you, Rory, for hosting that interview. And of course, that interview, if you found it informative, you want to dig a little bit deeper, Dr. John Wilson has made a complete lecture on this topic, and it's not his first lecture in our CPD library. You can get access to that by going into the Counsellor CPD library. If you remember, just log in and that is available for you. It'll be in the recently updated lectures. If you're not a member of the Counsellor CPD library and you want to access hundreds and hundreds of hours of CPD that is certified, delivered by experts in our field, then just go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is right there on the homepage, and an annual membership costs less than the price of 1 cup of coffee per month with a friend. It really does. So it's well worth having a look at. We try and make it low cost but very, very high quality. All of the lectures have learning outcomes. All of the lectures are certified, and you can find more about that at counsellingtutor.com. Check out the Counsellor CPD library. This has been Rory, episode 243 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started off with theory and practice, the important cornerstone of counselling, or one of the cornerstones of counselling, contracting. Ken and myself talked about the importance of contracting and how that presents through the arc of training into qualified life. In practice partner, we talked about the portfolio practice offering different types of training and opportunities to someone who's qualified, and building a career of many parts. And then finally, I caught up with Dr. John Wilson in Practice Matters, and he told us how adverse circumstances can complicate grief, a link to a fantastic lecture that's actually in our CPD library. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counselor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counselor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.